everyone could see your beautiful booty. There you go. Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I have a very special guest. This is Nestor. He is my sister's dog and we're going to make him a t-shirt. So let's go.
We are going to draft a pattern onto a piece of paper. Using one of Nestor's sweaters, we're going to turn it into a t-shirt pattern. So that the sweater doesn't shift while I work with it, I'm going to pin certain seams together. This side seam here, and the neck seam. Since we are making a t-shirt, I won't include the hood in the pattern. We are going to start by drawing all around the outside of the sweater. I'm making little notches at points and intersections that I want to take note of. Next, we're going to take a pin and poke through the fabric into the paper below. We're going to do this around every seam that we couldn't draw around. This includes the neck seam and the side seams. I'm going to put notch marks at the opening in the neck for the lead. Next, we're going to connect the dots that we made with the pin. You could also mark the binding at the end and the binding around the armhole. Don't forget to label your pattern pieces so you don't forget what's what. The center back had a bit of a curve in it, but I decided to do it on the fold and therefore make it a straight line. Since the fabric of the sweater is stretchy, it may have originally been a straight line, and I am also making the t-shirt out of stretchy fabric, so I don't think it's going to affect the shape too much. I did 1/2 inch seam allowance out of habit. Because I'm going to serge everything together, I should have only done about 1/4 inch. Curves can be a little tricky to add seam allowance to, so what I tend to do is just add points. I do a point at 1/2 inch, and then another point and another point. Then we can connect these dots together and get a perfectly matching curve. We're going to bring Nestor's sweater back in and trace around the chest part of the sweater. We're going to follow all the same steps as we did before. Trace around all the seams we can. Make notches at points and intersections. And poke your needle through all the remaining seams. Then we can connect the dots and finish off the pattern. I decided to make the center front on a straight line as well, and I took out the curve. If you have a breed such as a bulldog or something with a big barreled chest, you might want to add more to the curve rather than flatten it like I did. Then finish off your pattern piece by adding seam allowance and labels. Using our paper scissors, we're going to cut out the patterns. I wanted to double check the accuracy of the pattern we just made, so I laid Nestor's sweater onto the pattern and compared. Making a pattern out of anything stretchy can be a little tricky, because who knows how much it has stretched out already and how much it is stretching while you're making a pattern. So I don't expect the fit to be perfect, but we can always alter it later. So it looks like I wasn't happy with my armhole placement, so I'm going to go in and fix that up a little bit. I also realized that I added seam allowance to an edge that we didn't need to have seam allowance. The armhole has a binding, so we didn't need to add an extra 1/2 inch. So I cut that away. I'm going to lay my fabric out and make sure that the stretch runs in the correct direction. The stretch should go around the body, not from head to tail. And since I wanted to place both the center front and the center back on a fold, I'm going to lay my fabric down accordingly. Just as I was about to cut it out, I decided I wanted to add a different color binding at the hem. So I added 1/2 inch seam allowance at the hem and folded the binding under. I did this on both the back and the front of the pattern. Once everything's in place, we're going to cut out our fabric. So this time we're going to add 1/2 inch to the opposite end of the binding. That'll be the edge towards the neck seam. I decided to use black stretch fabric to do the binding and the sleeves. And we can lay this pattern over the edge of the fabric. And we'll do the same thing for the binding on the center front piece of the shirt. Cut the binding out. Okay, now we're done with the pattern. Everything is cut out. We're going to start by pinning the binding onto the bottom edge of the t-shirt pieces. Then we're going to serge it together. If you don't have a serger, you can use a stretch stitch or a twin needle on your sewing machine. This fabric doesn't fray, so we don't need to serge all of the edges. However, I am going to serge the other end of the binding because it's going to make it thicker and easier to stitch through with my double needle later. I'm going to fold over and pin that serged edge. Then we're going to install our twin needle. You can buy these at a fabric store, and they go into your machine just like a regular needle. And the way to thread your machine is exactly the same way as you normally would. You just use 2 threads instead of 1, and they split into either needle at the end. I use a dual cone thread holder to manage my thread. The 2 needle heads are different widths apart depending on what kind you buy. Sewing with a double needle is almost like sewing with a cover stitch. You have 2 straight lines at the top, and underneath you've got a zigzag stitch. If you're doing any stretchy fabric sewing, I highly recommend investing in a few double-headed needles. They are so fantastic. However, they are quite fragile, so I do recommend getting a larger handful. Now we're going to pin our front and backs together at the side seams. When we serge together these side seams, we're going to continue serging the raw edge of the back side pieces. Then we can stitch it together at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm using a single needle here because it is on the edge that does not stretch. However, you can use the double needle instead so that you're not switching between the single and the double throughout the entire project. Now we can fold over and pin that 1/2 inch seam allowance on our side seams. Then I'm going to top stitch it with the double needle. I'm going to fold up the serged edge and then fold the whole hem in half. In hindsight, I didn't need to fold up the serged edge. I could have just folded the whole thing in half. Once the whole hem is pinned, then we're going to top stitch with our double needle. I ended up doing a second pass on the blue fabric because it gave a nice edge. Okay, we're moving on to the neck. I measure the neck hole to figure out what length of binding we're going to need to cut. The black fabric that I'm using for the binding is 4-way stretch, so I don't need to worry about which direction I cut it in. I'm going to cut a strip that is 21 inches long. That was the measurement around the neck hole. I'm not going to add seam allowance to the length of this strip because I want the binding to be a little smaller than the neck hole opening so that it cinches it a little bit instead of gaping. I'm going to make this strip 1.5 inches wide. I did add 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. We can cut out our neck binding. We are going to pin and stitch the short end together. I use the double needle. I lined up that binding seam with one of the side seams on the front. And with right sides together, we're going to pin the binding all around the neck. For some unknown reason, I decided to use a single needle to stitch this on. As one would imagine, it's not going to stretch because of this. But don't worry, I'm going to fix my error later. Like we did before, we're going to serge the outer edge of the binding. This makes it easier to stitch on later with the double needle. I'm going to fold that serged edge over and to the inside of the garment. This should hide inside that previous seam that we made between the neck hole and the neck binding. Using binding like this is great because it hides all of our messes inside. Then I top stitched it with the double needle. Then we're going to move on to our little t-shirt sleeves. I measure around the armhole just like we did the neck hole. I use the same width as I did before, 1.5 inches. We're going to serge our sleeves together on the short side. I'm going to line the sleeve seam up with the bottom edge of the side seam. And with right sides together, I'm going to pin the sleeve to the shirt. We can do the same with the other side. Then I'm going to serge the sleeves onto the shirt. I forgot to record this part, but next I do the sleeve hem. I serge the raw edge of the sleeve. Then I fold under just that serged edge and I top stitch. When my sleeves are done, I realize it would have been a lot easier to have done the neck binding the same way and serge it on. So I pick open the neck binding and try again. So we had one side serged already, we're going to serge the other end to the neck opening. So now we can just fold the binding over, hiding all that mess inside, and top stitch with the double needle. All that's left to do is make the hole for the lead. So I bring my pattern back in and transfer those markings. I'm going to use the buttonhole on my machine to make this hole for the lead. I open up the hole with the seam ripper. When I tried it on Nestor, it was way too big for him. When he was wearing it, I was able to pin it to fit. So now I'm going to make these alterations. I'm going to take in the back by 4 inches, and I'm going to add a bit of a dart in the center front neck. As we did in the beginning, I'm going to pin at the seams so it doesn't shift while we work. With scissors, I'm going to cut open the center back. I'm going to mark my new center back and take the pins out. I'm also going to mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance and trim away all the excess. I'm going to make a 1/2 inch dart at the center front. I pin the dart in place, then I serge my raw edges on the center back. Now I'm going to pin my center back together. With a single needle, I'm going to stitch the center back at 1/2 inch except for the opening where the lead goes. I'm going to do a lot of back stitching around that opening. And I'm going to stitch the dart at the center front. And here is Nestor finally modeling the finished shirt. He loves chewing on pine cones. I added a few detail stitches at the center back with my double needle. Isn't he just the cutest? So one more thing we have to do is alter our pattern. We need to take away all that excess that we didn't need so that we can make Nestor many more t-shirts.
Thank you guys!